Metal Gear, the game that started it all, needs a remake. So obviously we're living in the era of the remake. The Resident Evil series is going through that at the moment. They very successfully remade Resident Evil 2, 3 and 4. I'm sure we're going to get more from that series. It's a series that's very dear to my heart, and I've got all the remakes that they've made so far, played the hell out of them, and they are really great. And Metal Gear is no stranger to the art of the remake. They've had Metal Gear Solid Twin Snakes, and we are finally getting a remake to Metal Gear Solid 3 Snake Eater in the form of Metal Gear Delta. Now, this is a fairly safe option for Konami, remaking a game that has already been scripted by Kojima. I understand that they're going to be using the same voice track, or at least some of the same voice tracks for that game. So aside from the visual stuff and the gameplay mechanics, there's not an awful lot of worry to be had when it comes to trying to emulate someone like Kojima with the writing. But eventually Konami are going to have to step out of their comfort zone and take on a more ambitious project. And I think Metal Gear and Metal Gear 2 in the form of remakes would be the perfect exercise for them. So let's dive into what a Metal Gear remake could look like. Now, this is, as always, just for fun. It's my point of view, and it's my spin on what the Metal Gear Solid series has been driven to up until this point, and what I would personally love to see based on the progression of the series up to this point. So, Metal Gear. The setting is Galsburg, South Africa, and your job as the rookie Solid Snake is to infiltrate the mysterious base known as Outer Heaven. Your unit, Foxhound, has discovered that this military nation known as Outer Heaven could potentially be housing a weapon of mass destruction. So the setting is that Foxhound, which is a special forces unit, a fictional high-tech special forces unit, has sent in their best operative, Grey Fox. Grey Fox arrived at Outer Heaven, and he was able to perform some recon before being captured and losing contact with Foxhound. His last words were Metal Gear. So Big Boss decides to send his rookie agent, Solid Snake, into Galsburg, and this is where the game begins. So how could this look? Well, the MSX game was obviously quite basic. I mean, great for the time, but it was the 80s, and with everything we've got now, especially with the last offering that was Metal Gear Solid, The Phantom Pain, we obviously are going to expect a little more. So throughout this, I will be suggesting possible changes and alterations, which will inevitably involve the plot being slightly altered, character interactions being altered and what have you, but we will cross that bridge when we come to it. So you, in my version, would start the game much like Metal Gear Solid 3 Snake Eater. Now, Metal Gear Solid Snake Eater was a departure from the norm, because what we'd seen before then is Snake being thrown into the area of operations. In Metal Gear Solid, he is at Shadow Moses Island right from the get-go. even in games like Metal Gear Solid 2, Raiden is at the big shell when we start, and we stay on the big shell for the majority of the game. Metal Gear Solid 3 was a departure from that because Snake was dropped in the jungle miles away from the Groznygrad facility, which is where he would eventually need to go and face the Shagohod. And it's this that I propose for this game. So I would drop Snake in Galsberg, and what we have to remember in the original lore is that this episode was known as the Outer Heaven Riot, the Outer Heaven Crisis. We do know from the lore that there's a resistance group that are against the Outer Heaven regime, and this gives us scope to have quite a large area of operations. We could have a jungle area, we could have a mountainous area, etc. So Snake is dropped into Galsberg, which is South Africa. It could be very heavy jungle, lots of bush and intense areas, swamps, things like that, mountainous areas, hilly areas, and all that good stuff. So you begin the game once again unarmed, and this is something that we haven't seen from the Metal Gear series for a while. When we played Ground Zeroes and Metal Gear Solid 4 and even Metal Gear Solid 5, the final game that we got to play, we had an arsenal of weapons that we could use right from the get-go. I would suggest going back to the procure on site method that Foxhound is known for, and send Snake in completely unarmed, because it just harkens back to that nostalgic feeling of arriving in the thick of it with absolutely nothing and having to get your equipment on site. So the original game, like I said, it was quite small. It only had 3 main areas. There were 3 buildings: building 1, building 2, where the prison and everything was, and then building 3, which is what housed the main Outer Heaven complex and the Metal Gear TX-55 itself. So you'd start off outside Outer Heaven, and you would have to go on operations in a similar way that you do in Metal Gear Solid 5. You'd have to go and rescue POWs, take out enemy soldiers, and build a rapport with resistance members. We've seen this before in a Metal Gear game. If you remember back to Metal Gear Solid 4, there was that section in the Middle Eastern war zone where you could build relationships with the resistance. There were the PMC forces that they were under the control of SOP, and so you could not interact with them in any other way than violently. But the resistance soldiers, you could choose to ignore them, you could actively oppose them for no other reason than it was quite funny, or you could help them. And if you helped them, they would start to do things like give you rations or give you ammo, or you could give them rations and ammo, and you would build that relationship and they would leave you alone. If you helped them in battle, they would even go as far as to cheer when you managed to do things like destroy enemy tanks and artillery and all that stuff. So I think it'd be quite interesting to have Solid Snake for the first few sections of the game, interacting with resistance members and trying to gain information on Outer Heaven. So when you arrive at the sort of gates of Outer Heaven, or the sort of outskirts of the facility, one thing that Snake has to go through is an underwater insertion. So this could be in the form of, say, you're in a jungled area and then you see that there's, I don't know, maybe like a moat or a big body of water that separates the main area from Outer Heaven. It could be that we know that Mother Base was an offshore facility. I'm not suggesting that we go that far and have Outer Heaven be an offshore plant or something that's set in the sea as such, but we could still have a body of water if you wanted to be a stickler and get that underwater section in. It would be cool to have more sections of this game where you could have Snake using breathing apparatus to swim underwater and do missions underwater, maybe underwater demolition missions and all that kind of thing. But we do know that at this point, Snake would infiltrate Outer Heaven and meet a man called Kyle Schneider. This is quite an important character going forward. Kyle Schneider is like our man on the ground. He gives us important information. We'd have to build trust with him, and he would also act as a kind of buddy, which is a great way to get the buddy system into this game. And he would give us information and weapons via the radio or the codec. I think it was a radio at this time because the codec only came in Metal Gear Solid. So yeah, he would have a radio similar to the one that we have in Metal Gear Solid 3. And eventually, you know, you would get more of a rapport with Kyle Schneider. And I think if there was a mechanic similar to the one where if, say, for example, on Metal Gear Solid 5, if you're with Quiet as a buddy, you can really build up the trust and you will benefit in game from building a relationship with the character, rather than if you do things like annoy them or ignore them. You know, if you accidentally shoot Quiet or if you accidentally shoot D-Dog in those games, then it will impact you in the game negatively. So it'd be quite cool to see those mechanics come back and really lend to this idea that there is a resistance out there trying to fight Outer Heaven, and we really want them on our side. So what happens next? Well, we have a section here that I would potentially cut. And the reason I'd cut it is because the next thing that happens is that Snake purposely gets himself captured in order to get taken to the prison cells so that he can make contact with Grey Fox. This instance, I suggest that we don't do that because it never quite made sense to me in the old MSX game that all of Outer Heaven was not then on alert and looking for Snake. That does come into the plot later, and we will discuss that. I think we should have a scenario here similar to what happens with the DARPA chief in Metal Gear Solid. So we have Solid Snake silently and covertly infiltrate the prison cells, and instead of getting himself captured and then brazenly punching through a wall, which happens in the original game, we can just either go underground through a tunnel or a grate in the wall, in the floor. You can go through a vent shaft, whatever, and make contact with Grey Fox. And this is where you would get your first sort of character moment. And this is really kind of something that you could make a big thing of, because this would potentially be, obviously, the remake version, but this is the series debut of Grey Fox. And Snake, for the legend that he would become, remember, Snake wasn't a legend at this point. Everything that Snake learned was in this mission and the next mission in Metal Gear 2. And he cites Grey Fox as a huge reason for making him the soldier he is. And it's really a great opportunity to have Snake and Grey Fox interact. It would be a great opportunity to show Grey Fox maybe putting Snake through his paces, teaching him things, and showing him the ropes, really. So we get this awesome interaction between Fox and Snake, and what we would have is obviously Fox being dehydrated, injured, malnourished, basically unable to help us in the fight. So he would go off to get help from the resistance. Maybe you have a scenario where Snake's like, I'll get my buddy Kyle to come and get you and take Fox off to recover. But in the meantime, we can still have Fox as a support person, someone that we speak to on the radio. But I don't think at this stage it would make much sense to have Fox as a buddy because he'd be too overpowered. The whole point of the buddies is to assist us. And if we have someone that can just do everything, then I don't think that would make much sense. For me, that's just my opinion. I think he's better off at this moment as being sort of out of the game physically. Maybe he's a little bit injured, a little bit dehydrated, exhausted, whatever. So he goes off, but first he tells us about Metal Gear and the person that we need to speak to get information about Metal Gear, and that is Dr. Drago Petrovich Madnar. And you might recognize the name Madnar because we know now that he did survive to the events of Metal Gear Solid 4, and he was actually the guy responsible for getting Raiden an infusion of artificial blood. But of course, that's a tale for another time. So we have Snake get information about Madnar, and he's off now. He's got to find this guy. But when he leaves the prison cells and sends Grey Fox off on his way, Snake is confronted by what will be the first boss fight of this game, and that will come in the form of Shotmaker. So Shotmaker is basically a glorified prison guard. He is ex-Spetsnaz. And I think there could be an opportunity here to show that one of the Russians that we captured in the Phantom Pain actually went on to become Shotmaker. He's armed with a shotgun, a riot gun, and various other equipment that makes him quite a tricky customer. But remember, this is the first boss fight, and in Metal Gear, the first boss fight will generally be like a practice run or a kind of a tutorial section. Ocelot in the Metal Gear Solid was very easy. It just served to get us used to the formula of fighting a boss. And when we came to fight Vulcan Raven, which if you look at it is really the heightened level of the Ocelot battle, we were a lot better and a lot more used to it. So it would be sort of a fairly easy boss fight to get us in the mood, to really get us used to this and get us started. And obviously we wouldn't have much in terms of equipment and weapons that we could use to defeat him. But eventually we would, and you would then be able to collect his gear. And this is something that I would want to bring in to the mechanics. Every time you face a boss, every time you beat them, you take their gear. So after Shotmaker was defeated, you get his riot gun and his shotgun and all that good stuff. So you fight Shotmaker and kill him, and then we discover, and I would only use this as a trope because it's a Metal Gear trope, but obviously with the way things have progressed now and with the engines being much better, it doesn't sort of have the same punch as it would have in Metal Gear Solid. But in this section, quite famously, Shotmaker puts a transmitter on Snake's equipment. He's got it, like I said, originally Snake would get himself captured on purpose, and this would allow Shotmaker to put a transmitter on his equipment. What I propose is that the transmitter, because we're not getting, in my version, we're not getting ourselves captured, the transmitter would already be on Shopmaker's equipment as like a crafty little play by Shopmaker to get the last laugh. So you would have to sort that out. You would get rid of the transmitter and carry on the mission, which would very quickly take you into the second boss fight. And that boss fight is against the very colourfully named Machine Gun Kid. So this is a battle against a guy with a machine gun, and it's nothing that we can't do, especially considering all the crazy stuff that we did in Metal Gear Solid 5. And that does make me question, really, what is the remake of Metal Gear Solid Delta? What's that going to be like? Because if we get a game like Metal Gear Solid 3 Snake Eater on a Fox engine, surely we're going to absolutely smash that mission, because the mission and the way things are set out, it really coincides with the technology that was available at that time. That's why we could never really play the Shadow Moses mission in the way that we did back in 1998. And let's be honest, Venom Snake from Metal Gear Solid The Phantom Pain could probably walk the length of Shadow Moses in about 10 minutes. So we're really going to have to get crafty here. We're going to have to get creative and figure out how we're going to do these boss fights. But regardless, there would be a scene with the Machine Gun Kid, and as I've said, that would result in you being able to collect the machine gun at the end of that small boss fight. Now, there is a scene here, and again, I don't know if we'd need to keep this in, but there is a scene in the original where Snake would parachute into a courtyard, fight a Hind D gunship, and battle a tank with landmines. These are all things that really would have seemed amazing back in 1987, even back in 1998 when we fought Raven's tank with landmines. But now, you know, it's been done. So we'd have to think of a more exciting way, or a more creative way to fight a helicopter, a tank, and a guy with a machine gun. And I don't quite know why we would need the parachuting scene in the game. Basically, Snake parachutes off a cliff into a courtyard. Not very stealthy. Pretty cool for the time, for 1987. Obviously, this was a big deal. Now, I would argue that we don't need any of this. Maybe this stuff gets cut. So this brings us on to what would have been Building 2. I'm going to call it Section 2 because I think, again, back with the old technology, it was a big thing to have Metal Gear set out over 3 buildings. We'll just say that it's 3 sections. So what happens now is, this is the point where the guards find out that Snake and Foxhound are investigating Outer Heaven, and maybe have even penetrated Outer Heaven. And so Big Boss gets on the radio to Snake and says, look, these guys know that you're here. They are looking for you. You need to get into Outer Heaven. This is where you need to use a disguise. And it's going to be really interesting to see how they do that. We didn't really get much of a disguise mission in the last game, Phantom Pain. It would be pretty cool on a Fox engine to see that replay of what we did with Raiden in Metal Gear 2, where we put the Galukovich soldier disguise on. And even in Metal Gear Solid 3, you had that really like weird rubber mask of Raiden, and you could go around Groznygrad as, it was Ivan, I think, that it was Volgin's lover. and you put the mask on and a scientist uniform, and you could run around completely undetected. So it'd be cool to have that mechanic on the Fox engine and be able to do so much more with it. You just have Snake dressed as an Outer Heaven soldier, and this would really allow us to get our main view of Outer Heaven and really feel what Outer Heaven is like. It would almost be similar to how you run around Mother Base in the Phantom Pain. When you run around Mother Base, all the soldiers are sort of saying hello to each other and saluting each other and getting into sort of conversations. You could enter into conversations with soldiers, and everyone's really sort of positive and talking about how much they love Outer Heaven, how much they love being a part of Big Boss's regime. Obviously, they wouldn't call him by name. So at this point, it's important to remember that we know that Outer Heaven is overseen by a legendary soldier. We don't know who that soldier is, obviously, but we just know that the guy is a big deal. He's a legend, and they could call him something else. They could even call him Ahab. So we have these soldiers referring to this guy, Ahab. Oh, he rescued me. I absolutely love it here. This is a place for soldiers. This is a place where soldiers have a purpose. And you get this feeling that maybe there are two sides to this story. Maybe Outer Heaven and this mysterious Ahab figure aren't the sadistic evil villains that we've been led to believe, and that would add conflict and a little bit of interest, a little bit of nuance to the plot. So you've got Snake in disguise, and he's learning about Outer Heaven, and his mission at this point is to make contact with Dr. Madnar. And this is the point in the original game where you would meet a fake Dr. Madnar who was armed with a suicide trap. I don't know what a suicide trap is. I would suggest it could be something similar to the micro bomb that the Cobra unit used in Metal Gear Solid 3 in their boss fights. It could be something that detonates when Snake gets close, but it would have to be something that you're alerted to and then are able to easily escape from. So let's say if it was like a micro bomb, that it blows up, it kills the decoy, and this would put you into sort of a dazed state and reveal that you aren't who you say you are. Remember, at this point you are in a disguise. So let's say that you're knocked to the floor, the building's on fire, there's debris everywhere, there's dust and smoke, and then the debris and the dust start to clear, and out walks a man in a gas mask with a flamethrower. And this is the Fire Trooper battle. So Fire Trooper is basically, if you look at the concept art and the original art, do you remember those guys in Metal Gear Solid 3 that were on the mountaintop with the flamethrowers? Well, basically, Fire Trooper is one of those guys. He's got a flamethrower and a gas mask, and I love boss fights like this. We've seen fire battles in the Metal Gear Solid series before, a few times with the Man on Fire and of course with the Fury. And I always love the visual and the anxiety that comes with an area that slowly gets engulfed by flames, and it's like you're being dragged down into hell. Everything's on fire. The area gets harder to navigate because if you step in the fire, you can take damage, and it really just adds for a really great boss fight. So this is something that we could get really creative with, and as you go through the boss fight, you're going to have to find creative ways to defeat the character, maybe again by using tried and true Metal Gear tropes like shooting pipes of gas or pipes of water or shooting fire extinguishers, and then eventually getting and shooting the backpack of the fire trooper, causing him to explode, and all that wonderful imagery that we've had in Metal Gear before, but can really do again in like a Fox engine type scenario, and really see those lovely details and those visuals and make it really satisfying and very, very cool. Anyway, after defeating Fire Trooper, and I'm not suggesting, by the way, that once we defeat the Fire Trooper that we get a flamethrower, although that could be an option and it could be very cool. Not particularly stealthy, but very cool. So after the Fire Trooper, we meet someone called Jennifer, who's a Resistance member, and she helps us get the location of the real Dr. Madnar. So again, we get to a section that is a little bit complicated and may require us to make some creative cuts and changes, because this is a section of the game that relies quite heavily on plagiarism. So at this point, Dr. Madnar is in a cell that's guarded by two things. These things are called bloody brads. So a bloody brad, if you look at the artwork, it's essentially a complete rip-off of the T-800 from the Terminator films. That's all they are, even down to the leather jacket and sunglasses. Now, I don't know, maybe this was okay in 1987, but I don't think we'd get away with that now. As nostalgic and cool as it is, we'd have to do something else. We'd have to do some kind of Metal Gear Android. I always felt like the Bloody Brad concept was a strange one, because they're basically invincible. And the technology is like, you know, they're essentially T-800s. They're organic tissue over like a metal endoskeleton. And it just sort of seemed a little bit out of place. It could work if we make them, you know, like more like the Skulls, where they're overpowered super soldiers, or, you know, you could have like robot cyborg elements in there. But they are, like, as far as I can ascertain, they are basically automatons. They have one job, that's to guard the cell. They're really difficult to kill. So we'd have to find a creative way around that. We couldn't just completely rip off the Terminator movies in this instance. We'd have to figure out what we're doing with the Bloody Brads, or potentially think of something else and cut them completely. But that aside, we would eventually come face to face with the creator of Metal Gear TX55, Dr. Madnar. And in true Metal Gear fashion, Dr. Madnar, it's not as simple as just rescuing him and finding out the information. He has a side quest for us. Now, as gamers, we're no stranger to side quests, and Dr. Madnar has his own problems. He's a prisoner of Outer Heaven, but his daughter, Ellen, is also a prisoner of Outer Heaven, and he is not going to help us or tell us anything about the TX55 unless we go and help his daughter, Ellen. So we're on another mission, and this would require us to fight through Outer Heaven, fight through the mercenaries, and meet up with another Resistance member called Diane, who would then tell us where Ellen is. And I kind of like that we'd be meeting all these Resistance members. It really gives the Resistance character, and I like the fact that they're all named, and this Diane could potentially be another person that we add to our radio/codec list. She could give us real-time information and just help us on our way. So anyway, eventually we do find Ellen, and Ellen lets us know that Madnar has been forced to work on Metal Gear. And this is kind of sus for me. I've always been of the belief that things in Metal Gear aren't quite as clear. I've spoke about this in other videos, that I think Grey Fox, for example, was in on the whole thing from the beginning. And part of me thinks that Madnar was as well. Part of me thinks this is kind of a ruse, because we do find Madnar aligning with Big Boss's agenda in the sequel, spoiler alert. But that's a story for another day, and we will get there. So Ellen is rescued by Solid Snake, and this gets us critical information and curries favour with Madnar, who is happy to have his daughter safe and well with him, and he tells us that if we want to defeat Metal Gear TX55, we're going to have to go for the weak points, which are on the legs, specifically the feet. So we learn that we need to go for the Metal Gear's feet, and we set off to the bunker where Metal Gear is being housed. And this is where the game starts to take a turn. Again, in a true Metal Gear trope, the guy that we're on the radio to, in this case, Big Boss, starts acting kind of strange. And it's that callback to that moment that everyone talks about, and that lots of memes have been made from Metal Gear Solid 2 Sons of Liberty, where the Colonel starts going funny. The same thing would happen here with Big Boss, and he starts acting out of character, starts telling us things that are wrong, giving us misinformation. And this would all culminate in him basically saying, abort the mission, turn the console off, turn back, go home, stop what you're doing. And this is where Snake disobeys Big Boss. He turns the radio off. He knows that something strange is going on, something fishy is going on. His guts are telling him that he needs to turn the radio off, and this is what he does. And he goes and he sees Jennifer, who gives him some diving equipment. And this is where we're into another underwater section. And I think we could make, with the Fox engine, with those mechanics, I think we could do a really cool Metal Gear underwater section. And this may be where you bring back the air quotes bloody Brad models that could maybe follow you underwater. I harken back to that great sequence in not a particularly great film, but it's a great sequence in Alien Resurrection, where the aliens are chasing the main characters underwater in that underwater section, and it's kind of really tense, and they're desperately trying to swim as fast as they can. You could have a situation like that where you're Snake, you're underwater, and there's some kind of bloody Brad or even Outer Heaven mercenaries that dive into the water to try and find you, and there's like this whole escape scene where you're in diving equipment, and that could look super cool and really cinematic, really like awesome Metal Gear action. And basically you go through the underwater section, and when you get on the other side, what do we have? Well, another bloody side quest. Jennifer is now blackmailing Snake and saying that she will not help him with any more and not tell him any more information unless he goes and rescues her brother. So she sent him to what he thinks will be the location of the Metal Gear. She's actually sort of played a dirty one on him and sent him to the place where her brother's been held. And again, this just shows that Snake is constantly being used, being lied to, misled, screwed over, which is something that we see throughout his entire career. And it's something that we saw throughout the entirety of Big Boss's career. Now, Snake takes it very differently. He reacts differently to Big Boss. It's a massive part of his character. He's constantly being used and abused by people. And again, this is really the opening of the timeline. This is the first game, technically, in the Metal Gear timeline. So this is the introduction and the beginning of the idea that Snake is a commodity. He's a tool of the government. You remember that quote from Grey Fox? We're not tools of the government. Well, this is really showing that at this moment in time, he is a tool to be used by people. So he has to go and rescue Jennifer's brother. It's another side quest, and this takes us conveniently into the boss fight with the Dirty Duck. This is a wacky character. He's got razor boomerangs, and he throws them at Snake, and he also uses human shields, which are captured POWs, resistance members, and these do include Jennifer's brother. And it's the kind of scenario you could have where you're doing the fight, and if you accidentally end up killing or lead to Jennifer's brother dying, then it's game over. So what you have is a kind of weird boss fight with boomerangs, and eventually you would kill Dirty Duck and rescue Jen's brother, which means that she now agrees to help you again, and she finally tells you where the Metal Gear is, and you are making your way down to the I basically think this is a good section to have like a big codec call. So whereas in Metal Gear Solid you were on those huge lifts that took you underground, on this section you would be on like a lift or something going underground, and Kyle Schneider, the leader of the resistance, calls you and says, I've got some pretty big information about the leader of Outer Heaven. I know who he is. And just as he's about to tell you, his radio cuts off. So at this point, we know, and it's one of those great things where the audience knows what's cracking off, but the character has no idea. And it sets up for a massive showdown. So we get the Metal Gear fight. Finally, we're in a hangar. We're with Metal Gear TX55, and there's a huge battle. And Snake, obviously, we've had some amazing mech fights in these games. Imagine, you know, the Sahelanthropus fight. It's got to be massive. It's got to be gigantic. It's got to be cinematic. So we get that, and Snake manages, obviously, to destroy the Metal Gear. And the pilot of Metal Gear is revealed. It's Big Boss. But it's actually, we know, it's Venom Snake. Now, Venom Snake and Solid Snake would fight. There'd be a massive sort of cinematic boss battle. Again, we didn't really get that on the Fox engine in Metal Gear Solid, where you had to just persevere with CQC and have like a fist fight that lasted, you know, a fair amount of time. So I want to see how that could be done. It's got to be this huge deal. These two amazingly talented soldiers, warriors, CQC experts fighting each other, and I would want this fight to go on, and eventually lead to Solid Snake defeating Venom Snake. And this brings us to basically the end of the game. As far as Solid Snake's concerned, Big Boss betrayed him, and he was murdered and killed by Solid Snake, and Solid Snake feels really sort of conflicted over this. He thinks he feels like he has murdered his CO, but also that his CO betrayed him, so deserved to die, and he's got no idea that this was Venom Snake all along. Snake, Jennifer, Grey Fox, Madnar and his daughter Ellen all escape the facility, but many, many people are left behind, and we know that some of these characters will become important for later games. We know that Kyle will be rescued by Big Boss. So we have an escape scene with the bulk of the main characters escaping Outer Heaven, as Outer Heaven is blown to smithereens by the self-destruct mechanism and then a NATO airstrike, which completely decimates the base as our heroes escape. And here ends the game. But I think it'd be pretty cool if we've lost, obviously, contact with Foxhound. What if we get the radio back up and running? And this is the first time, the series debut of Roy Campbell, who directs us to our escape route and sets up his involvement in the next game. So Outer Heaven is destroyed, and this is covered in the media, covered up as being a huge earthquake that destroys Galsburg and means that nobody asks any very awkward questions about this strange military society that popped up in South Africa. So the ending, I think it would be cool here if we did something similar to a wonderful fan video that I absolutely adore, and it's called Last Day in Outer Heaven. I highly recommend you find this and watch it, guys. It was a comic. They turned it into a motion comic, and they also animated a version of it. But if you go online and type in Last Day in Outer Heaven, you'll find it. It's incredible. It's beautifully done. Very, it's wonderfully done and very inventive, creative and beautiful. And it shows Venom Snake giving his dying breath. It sets up Zanzibar land, and also you do get Quiet's ghost, and I kind of love that. You know, we've had ghosts in Metal Gear before with the Sorrow, so it gives Venom Snake his moment with Quiet, and he can pass away peacefully. And yeah, I love things like this. I'm a sucker for that kind of thing. We know Schneider is rescued. You could sort of set that up or show a sort of after credit scene of that. And that's it. That's the end of Metal Gear, the remake, and sets us up nicely for Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake. So that's my proposal for this remake, and I cannot wait to really get into Metal Gear Solid 2 because that's really my favourite of these two games. So we will get into that, but this has been a long video. Thank you so much, guys, for listening, and I cannot wait to see you in the next one. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Leave a comment. Tell me what you think. Do you agree with what I've said, or do you have better suggestions? Do you have things that you desperately want to see? Do you have anything that you really don't want to see from the original Metal Gear game? Let me know, and we can strike up a conversation. As you know, I love talking about Metal Gear, and I can't wait to hear what you think. So with that said, I bid you a goodbye and safe travels, and I will see you all, hopefully, in the next one. See you later.